We'll see today the deliverance the Lord will bring. Behind him the rumble grew louder. In front, the sea didn't move. And then Moses closed his eyes, not to escape, but to hear. Because sometimes, the only way to hear God's voice is to silence every other one. And it came, not like thunder, not like fire, but like direction. Raise your staff. That was it. Moses opened his eyes, took another step and lifted his staff. The wind began. At first gentle, like a new breath, then stronger, until the sand began to shift, and the sea began to retreat, as if obeying, as if recognizing the one who had formed it. The waters rose, like walls of glass, and the ground, became dry. A corridor was born where only despair had existed. The people looked at each other speechless. Moses didn't yell, didn't command. He simply walked, first with slow, steady steps, and the rest, followed. Not because they knew what would happen, but because they chose to trust. The word, the wind, the God who, until now, had never left them. But the noise still came from behind. Pharaoh saw the sea part too, and with wounded pride he entered, because some men would rather drown than see others be free. The wheels of the chariots dug into the moist earth. Soldiers shouted, horses neighed, but nothing was louder than the silence of faith. The crossing had begun, but the story was far from over. The ground was dry, yet still damp, as if it had just awakened from a 1,000-year sleep. The sand mixed with salt clung to their feet, leaving footprints not meant to be erased by the wind, but by history. On one side, water, on the other, more water. Liquid walls, raised like invisible ramparts held up by divine hands. Fish swam within reach of their eyes, as if the world had been split in half. But no one stopped to look. No one dared to admire the miracle. They were too busy surviving it. Children were carried on shoulders, women wept in silence, men looked side to side, afraid the waters might collapse. The sound of their own footsteps echoed between the watery walls, and each step was a wordless prayer. Not now, don't close yet. Just a little farther, just until the other side. Moses walked ahead, steady, but not without weight, the staff still in his hand, a reminder of who was truly in control. Not him, but the one who had told him to raise it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence of heaven felt different now. It wasn't absence, it was authority. God didn't need to repeat himself. The path was already open. But then, the sound returned. It wasn't the sea. It wasn't the wind. It was the thundering of hooves. Behind them, dust rose even on the wet ground. Pharaoh had not relented. He had entered the same path. With armor, with spears, with war cries, as if the passage belonged to him too. As if the miracle could be stolen. They're coming. A young man shouted from the rear. Panic, screams, despair. Some wanted to run, others to turn back. But where to? There were no sides, only forward. And faith. A woman fell. 2 men lifted her quickly. An elder began praying aloud. Children cried. The sound of horses grew louder, and with it, the weight of doubt. What if God had started the miracle, but didn't finish it? Moses paused, not in fear, but instinct, as if he sensed a presence behind him. Not the Egyptians, but God. He turned, looked back, and then he saw it. Between the last Hebrew and the first Egyptian, there was light. But not ordinary light. It was like fire and cloud at once, like day and night coexisting. It was the pillar, the same one that had guided them by day and protected them by night. Now it stood between them and the enemy, and it did not move. The horses pulled back, the soldiers hesitated. The light did not blind, it blocked, as if whispering, "You don't own this road." The people continued, faster now, but with something new growing in their chests. Hope, not because they knew the ending, but because God was still there. The path was long. The water walls stretched on, and so did the light. But something began to stir inside each of them. It wasn't joy, not yet, nor celebration, just a whisper. We will make it. We will reach the end. We will not die here. Moses walked faster. The people followed, and behind the miracle held its ground. But they didn't yet know. The real climax wasn't the crossing. It was what would happen after, because the sea was still open, and the enemy hadn't given up. Have you ever been so close to freedom that you could almost taste it on your lips? Have you ever seen salvation right before your eyes, and yet feared it might vanish before you could touch it? That was exactly the feeling in that moment. The last group of Hebrews was running through the path carved between the waters. Children were almost dragged along by their parents who no longer had the strength to keep a steady pace. The sand clung to their feet, the wind lashed against their faces, and the salty smell of the sea mingled with the sweat of their effort. And the noise, oh, the noise was deafening. On one side, the deep roar of the restrained sea, like a chained beast waiting to strike. On the other, the ever-growing sound of chariot wheels, galloping hooves, and weapons clanging with every step. And then, something changed. The pillar of cloud and fire, which had held the Egyptians back for so long, began to move. Slowly, like a guardian who, having fulfilled its duty, now steps aside. This was the moment the enemy had been waiting for. With war cries, the soldiers charged forward. The metallic echo rang through the watery corridor. A cold wave of fear swept through the people. Moses, standing at the far end of the path, looked back. He didn't just see an army. He saw the entire past rushing toward them. Every whip, every tear shed in Egypt, every brick molded in pain, all of it was coming for them. And he knew, either God acted now, or there would be no future, Lord. His voice rose above the chaos. They are upon us. The wind grew stronger, the sea seemed to tremble, and in Moses' heart something burned, a command clear as daylight, strong as a silent thunder. Lift your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea. He obeyed. The staff rose against the darkened sky. The people, still running, looked at him with a mix of hope and dread. The waters, already standing tall, seemed to wait, as if awaiting permission to move. Then Moses made the motion. Suddenly the ground began to change. The once firm sand grew damp beneath their feet. The roar of the sea swelled. The watery walls began to lean, first slowly, then with unstoppable force. What followed was indescribable. The sea closed in like gates being slammed shut with fury. The crash of the waters was like 1,000 storms at once. Chariots were swallowed whole, horses neighed in panic, soldiers shouted and fought to swim, but were dragged under by the crushing current, and the people stopped. They stood on the opposite shore, soaked in sweat, tears, and sea spray. Some fell to their knees, others embraced, unable to speak a single word. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of victory. Moses lowered the staff. His body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from reverence. He knew he had just witnessed not only a miracle, but God's judgment upon those who had stood against his people. Then, someone began to sing, a simple melody, yet heavy with emotion. Soon others joined, and the air was no longer filled with the sound of battle, but with the sound of gratitude. The crossing was over. The sea was closed. Egypt was behind them, but deep down they all knew the journey had only just begun. For crossing the sea was only the first test. The greatest one still lay ahead. In the desert, have you ever experienced a moment of victory, only to be met by a silence that seemed endless? Have you ever witnessed a miracle so great that you thought all your problems were over, only to find a new challenge waiting at the door? That was exactly what happened to Israel. The song of victory still echoed in the air. Voices that had once cried out in fear now lifted in praise. Women played tambourines, children danced, and even the elders raised their hands, overwhelmed to still be alive. The Red Sea was behind them, and with it, all the years of slavery. But ahead, only the desert. The sun climbed higher, burning their skin and blinding their eyes. The sand reflected the light like embers scattered across the ground. Steps that had been firm and full of hope grew heavy. The water they had carried in jars began to run out. The singing gave way to murmuring, and then, the murmuring turned into complaints. "Moses, we're going to die out here," shouted a man from the crowd. "At least in Egypt we had food." Another replied. The words cut like knives. The leader who had guided them by the very hand of God now heard from his people only ingratitude and fear, and with every step deeper into the wilderness, the silence of heaven seemed heavier. No voice, no sign, only the dry wind blowing. Moses stopped and looked toward the horizon. All he saw was another kind of sea, a sea of endless sand, but something inside him whispered that the same God who had parted the sea of water could also open a way through the sea of despair. 3 days passed, 3 days without finding water. When they finally spotted an oasis, they ran desperately, plunging their hands into the cool water. But as soon as they tasted it, they spat it out. It was bitter, undrinkable. The people wept. Some fell to their knees. Others turned on Moses in anger. "Why did you bring us here just to die of thirst?" The prophet's heart ached. He looked up to heaven, praying silently, and then God spoke. Not with thunder, not with earthquakes, but with a simple instruction. "Moses, take that piece of wood and throw it into the water." He obeyed. The moment it touched the surface, the bitter water became sweet. The people drank until they were satisfied. Children smiled, women filled their jars, and hope began to burn again in their hearts. But God didn't just want to quench Israel's physical thirst. He wanted to teach them that in the desert, survival doesn't come from strength, but from obedience. As they continued their journey, another test came. Hunger rose against them. Once again, complaints filled the air. "In Egypt we had bread, meat. Here we have nothing." Then, one morning, something strange happened. Round the camp, there was a fine layer like dew that had dried, leaving behind a thin white coating. The people looked at each other, confused. "Man, who?" they asked. "What is it?" Moses answered. "It is the bread the Lord is giving you." And so, day after day, manna fell. The bread from heaven sustained the people, but even with a daily miracle, some still gathered more than they needed, only to see the excess rot. It was as if God was saying, "Trust me, one day at a time." The desert was not just a physical place, it was a classroom, and there, God was shaping a people who would not just witness miracles, but learn to live trusting in the provider, not merely in the miracle. Moses knew there was still a long road to the promised land, but he also knew that the same God who sustained his people in the silence was still guiding every step. The desert was not the end. It was only the preparation for the promise. Have you ever felt that God's promise was so close you could almost touch it, but at the same time, felt afraid that after walking so far, something might still stop it from happening? That was exactly how Israel felt. After years in the wilderness, facing hunger, thirst, enemies, and even their own doubts, the people finally arrived at the plains of Moab. On the other side of the Jordan River was Canaan, the promised land. It was like watching a dream take form before their eyes. But there was still one last obstacle. The river was at flood stage. The muddy, violent waters seemed to say, "You made it this far, but you won't cross." Joshua, now the leader after Moses' death, stood before the tribes and spoke with a steady voice. "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." The words echoed throughout the camp. Men and women purified themselves, families prepared, and the next morning, the priests took the Ark of the Covenant and walked toward the waters. What happened next? No one could have predicted. The moment the priests' feet touched the river, the current stopped. The rushing waters rose up like a wall, while the riverbed opened before them. The people crossed on dry ground. Step by step, each family carried not only their tents and belongings, but also the weight of every memory. The slavery, the parted sea, the wilderness, the hunger and thirst, and now freedom. When all had crossed, God gave a special command. Choose 12 men, one from each tribe, and take 12 stones from the middle of the river, from the place where the priest stood. These stones would be a memorial, so that in the future, when their children asked, "What do these stones mean?" they could answer, "Here the Lord stopped the Jordan before us, so we would know his hand is mighty and that we must fear him forever." And so, they finally set foot on the land God had promised to Abraham centuries before. A land flowing with milk and honey, a symbol of provision, rest, and blessing. But the story was never just about reaching a geographic location. It was about becoming a people shaped by God. Every step in the wilderness had been necessary. Every tear, every prayer, every miracle, and every moment of divine silence had built in them something greater: faith. Many believe Israel's greatest victory was crossing the sea or the Jordan, but the real victory was learning to trust the God who guided every step, even when the path seemed impossible. And today, that story echoes for us. Maybe you are in the middle of your own wilderness, with the promise still far away. Maybe the waters before you seem impassable. But the same God who parted the sea, who sustained in the desert, and who stopped the Jordan, is still the same today. Their crossing was a landmark in history. Yours can be a landmark in your life. Never forget, the wilderness is not the end. It says the place where God proves his presence is enough, until the day you set foot in your promised land. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next emotional Bible narratives. Each video is made to inspire, encourage, and remind you that God's hand still guides the steps of those who trust him.